We often discuss different training variables and how they influence muscle growth. However, it can become somewhat confusing if these variables aren't ranked in a priority list. So in this video, we will discuss which training variables are most and least important for hypertrophy training so that we can make sure to put the most effort into the variables that have the biggest impact. First, let's explore the variables that will be discussed in this video and provide a general overview of how they influence muscle growth. So in no particular order, let's now explore these variables. First is volume. This refers to the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. We generally find that more volume tends to result in superior muscle growth. For example, this study explored the effects of training with 16 versus 24 versus 32 sets per muscle group per week. And as we can see, more volume resulted in greater muscle growth, even up to extremely high volumes. However, there are likely diminishing returns, meaning more volume may result in less additional muscle growth. This was established in this systematic review, which gathered the data on low versus moderate versus high volume training. It was found that while moderate volumes tended to be significantly superior to low volumes, high volume training was only marginally more effective than moderate volumes. So the volume hypertrophy relationship probably looks something like this. As we can see, more volume is likely superior, but each additional set per week may be less additionally effective. So at the extreme end of the spectrum, doing more volume may simply not be worth the time and effort. Next, we have proximity to failure. This refers to how close to failure we take each set. This is usually quantified using the reps in reserve scale, or RIR for short. 0 reps in reserve means we couldn't have performed any more good quality reps in the set. 1 RIR means we could have performed 1 more rep in that set. 2 RIR means we could have performed 2 more reps, and so on. While we don't need to train to complete failure all the time, we probably want to take all sets fairly close to failure to maximize muscle growth. This is because motor unit recruitment follows what we call the size principle. This suggests that muscle fibers are only recruited as they are needed throughout a set. So when we begin a set, only some of the motor units are initially involved to lift the weight. And as we get closer and closer to failure, more and more motor units are involved as the initial muscle fibers fatigue. So by the end of a set, if we train close enough to failure, all muscle fibers will be recruited and trained. As a general rule, when training with heavier loads in the approximate 6 to 10 rep range, we don't need to train quite as close to failure, probably around 2 to 3 reps in reserve, for all motor units to be recruited. When we train with moderate loads in the approximate 10 to 15 rep range, we probably need to train a little closer to failure to ensure all muscle fibers are trained, probably around 1 to 2 reps in reserve. And with lighter loads in the approximate 15 to 20 plus rep range, we probably need to train very close to failure to ensure all motor units are recruited and all muscle fibers are trained, probably around 0 to 1 reps in reserve. Next, let's discuss frequency. Frequency refers to how many times per week a muscle is trained. However, it should be noted that whenever we discuss frequency, we are assuming that volume is equated. So frequency is essentially a factor of volume. For example, if we trained a muscle with 12 sets per week, training this muscle once per week would mean that all 12 sets are performed in a single session. If we train this muscle 2 times per week, we would perform 6 sets per session. And if we train the same muscle 3 times per week, we would perform 4 sets per session. So as we can see, total weekly volume is the same in all cases, although it is distributed differently across the week. So how does frequency influence muscle growth? Well, according to this research review, frequency doesn't seem to have much of an effect on muscle growth at all when volume is equated. However, there does seem to be a slight trend in favor of higher frequencies. As we can see, training a muscle 2 or 3 times per week is probably a little more hypertrophic compared with training a muscle only once per week. Next, let's discuss rep ranges and load. We have combined rep ranges and load together into one category here because they have an inverse relationship with each other. In other words, if we train with a heavier load, we can't perform as many reps, and if we train with a lighter load, we will perform more reps, assuming we are training fairly close to failure. Traditionally, it was thought that the approximate 8 to 12 rep range was the sweet spot for muscle growth. However, recent evidence suggests that this isn't the only rep range that can be maximally effective for hypertrophy training. While strength gains are certainly superior when training with heavier loads, hypertrophy doesn't necessarily follow this same principle. It has been well established that hypertrophy can be equally achieved across a large spectrum of different rep ranges and loads, assuming we are training close to failure. This latest meta-analysis compiled the evidence on load lifted and muscle growth. The authors concluded that hypertrophy gains are likely to be similar on a per set basis, regardless of load lifted, assuming we are training close to failure. However, this doesn't mean we can just lift with any rep range that we like and see equal muscle growth. There are still limits as to how heavy and how light we can train. The effective hypertrophy range is just much larger than we once thought. Without going into too much detail about where exactly these limits lie, this systematic review provides a good practical summary. The researchers suggested that when training anywhere in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range seems to be equally effective for muscle growth on a per set basis, assuming we are training close to failure. There is even evidence suggesting we can actually train with even higher rep ranges than this, but I don't think it is very practical in most cases to train above 20 reps per set. So I think that this rough 6 to 20 rep range is a good practical guideline. Next, let's discuss lifting technique. Technique is difficult to define as a single variable because it incorporates many different components. Technique encompasses factors such as tempo, range of motion, and biomechanics. So we won't be going into too much detail about each component in this video, rather we will just refer to technique as a whole. As a general guide, we usually want to lift in the following way to maximize muscle growth. First, we want to lift in a way that puts maximum tension on the target muscle and minimum tension on other accessory muscles. This will ensure the target muscle is the limiting factor of each set, so that it is maximally stressed and no other systems limit performance. Second, we want to train with a full range of motion for whatever lift we are performing. This has been clearly shown to be superior for muscle growth for most exercises, likely because it usually stresses the muscle at longer lengths. We also want to use a controlled eccentric tempo. The exact duration or cadence isn't all that important, as long as it is somewhat controlled, so that the muscle is doing work, not just falling under gravity. And lastly, we want technique to be strict throughout the entire set. This means we should stay composed and avoid any momentum or deviation in form. Simply put, the last rep of a set should look exactly the same as the first rep, only slower. Lifting with these general technique guidelines in mind will have an effect on both muscle growth directly, but also on fatigue and injury risk. Strict and effective technique will be more effective to stress the target muscle and will usually result in greater muscle growth. This technique will also usually mean that we get a better stimulus even with lighter loads, compared with cutting range of motion, using momentum, etc. Also, because loads are lighter, we are inducing less joint stress and probably reducing our risk of both acute and chronic injury. So improving lifting technique allows us to get a better hypertrophic stimulus on the target muscle with less joint and connective tissue stress. Next, let's discuss exercise selection. This refers to which exercises we implement into our program to train each muscle group. Obviously, we want to select exercises which train the target muscle, although there is more nuance to exercise selection than just this. Should we implement a compound or isolation lift, a free weight or machine-based exercise? How many exercises should we perform for each muscle? And much more. As a general overview, let's briefly cover some important considerations for exercise selection. First and most important, we want to make sure the exercise requires the target muscle to contract against resistance. This will be based on the anatomy of the muscle and the movement pattern of the exercise. Second, we probably want to prioritize exercises which have a higher chance of the target muscle being the limiting factor. This is to ensure the target muscle is maximally stressed. For example, an overhead press will train the triceps to some extent, but they are unlikely to limit performance before the delts. We also want to prioritize exercises which train the muscle at long muscle lengths, or in a stretched position. Training a muscle at longer lengths is generally going to be more hypertrophic than training at shorter lengths. For example, deep squats and leg extensions both train the quads, but deep squats will train the quads at a longer length in the bottom position compared with the leg extension. And lastly, we want to prioritize exercises which have a fairly even tension curve throughout the entire range of motion. This means the resistance on the muscle is similar at all portions of the movement, rather than being very difficult at one portion and very easy at another portion. So while there are many different exercises that we can choose to train each muscle group, some may be more or less effective than others based on these factors. Therefore, trainees should try to implement the exercises that provide the best hypertrophic stimulus specifically for them. And the last variable we will discuss in this video is rest periods, or interset rest. This refers to the time taken between each set of an exercise. It is generally found that muscle growth can be achieved with both longer and shorter rest periods. However, we usually find that longer interset rest is slightly superior in most cases. This was established in this systematic review, which analysed the evidence on rest periods for muscle growth. It was concluded that significant muscle growth can be achieved with both short and long rest periods, but longer rest periods are generally a little bit more effective. However, most of the studies included in this analysis used full body workouts with mainly compound lifts. However, when we look at a single muscle group trained in isolation, the results we find are different. For example, this study explored the effects of traditional training with 90 seconds rest between sets versus drop sets with no rest between sets while performing tricep pushdowns. As we can see, the drop set training resulted in superior muscle growth of the triceps compared with the traditional training. Although this study and a few other similar studies didn't isolate the variable of rest periods specifically, they do suggest that shorter rest periods may be superior for isolation lifts, while longer rest periods tend to result in greater muscle growth for compound lifts. In either case, both longer and shorter rest periods can both be effective for muscle growth, although the exact time taken between sets may differ slightly based on what exercises we are performing. Now that we have covered the fundamentals of each training variable, let's now put them into a priority list. We will rank each variable on how important it is relative to the other variables and try to give a rational explanation why. Before we do this, it is important to understand that no single variable is effective in isolation. Rather, all of these variables are interrelated, and each one will influence the other. So we should never focus all of our attention on a single variable. We should probably try to maximize each one for the best chances of maximal muscle growth. With this being said, let's now explore the priority list. First on the list, I have put proximity to failure. I believe this is the most important variable for hypertrophy training. This is because you could implement all the other variables perfectly in a program, but without sufficient effort, they won't have much, if any, effect at all. We could lift with perfect technique and very high volumes, but if we aren't training anywhere close to failure, this will hardly induce any disruption to homeostasis and therefore minimal adaptation. Second on the list, I have put volume. As we know, more volume tends to result in superior muscle growth. So volume essentially refers to the dosage of training, in other words, how much we do. So assuming we are training close to failure, doing more volume is likely going to be beneficial for muscle growth. This has been put in second place because if we train with a close proximity to failure and high volumes, we are likely to see some muscle growth even if technique is poor or the exercises we select aren't the most effective. Next on the priority list, I have put lifting technique. Once we have ensured that we are training close to failure with a sufficient amount of volume, technique becomes very important. Lifting with strict and effective technique will improve the stimulus of each set and reduce overall joint stress. This will essentially make each set slightly more hypertrophic and minimize our risk of injury. Next, I have chosen exercise selection. As we know, hypertrophy can be achieved using many different exercises which train the same muscle group. So there are no mandatory exercises, which is why it doesn't rank very high on the priority list. However, exercise selection is still important because, like we mentioned earlier in the video, we can improve the hypertrophic stimulus of each set by selecting the exercises which provide the greatest stress to the target muscle. Now getting towards the less important variables for hypertrophy training, we have rep ranges and load. As we know, there is a very large spectrum of rep ranges and loads that can be used to maximize muscle growth. So for this reason, it doesn't really matter too much what specific rep ranges we train in, provided that we are somewhere within the approximate 6 to 20 rep range. Some exercises will be better suited to different rep ranges over others, but ultimately it isn't the most important variable to be concerned with. In second last position, we have interset rest periods. Once again, we can achieve great muscle growth with both short and long interset rest, as long as we train close to failure. For most exercises, longer rest periods are probably going to be slightly superior, and for some isolation lifts, shorter rest periods may be slightly superior. But overall, even if we pay no conscious attention to interset rest, we will probably see great muscle growth by ensuring the variables above this are performed well. And this brings us to the last variable on our priority list, which is frequency. This could arguably be above rest periods depending on how you look at it, but I have placed it as least important on our list. This is because all the research gathered together still hardly finds any difference in hypertrophy outcomes when volume is equated. Even hitting each muscle once per week will still likely result in almost as much muscle growth compared with distributing this volume across 2 or more sessions per week. Frequency can definitely have indirect benefits, such as allowing us to accumulate more volume, but as an independent variable alone, it probably doesn't have a very large influence on hypertrophy outcomes. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. There are many training variables that are often discussed, but very rarely do we consider which ones are more important than others. Some variables have a large influence on muscle growth, while others are less important. Therefore, we should ensure that we are taking care of the most important variables first, such as proximity to failure and volume, before putting too much thought into less important variables, such as rest periods and training frequency. Trainees can use this priority list to make sure they are spending the most amount of effort on the variables which have the largest effect, and the least amount of effort on the variables which have minimal effect. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.